The air at the auction hung thick and heavy, a mix of late October dust, diesel fumes, and the cloying scent of cheap coffee from the ladies' auxiliary tent. It was the smell of defeat. Martha stood by the weathered, clapboard siding of the barn, her hands shoved deep into the pockets of a canvas jacket that had belonged to Frank. It still smelled of him, a faint aroma of sawdust, motor oil, and honest sweat. Her knuckles were white, pressed against the rough fabric as she watched the auctioneer, a fast-talking man named Earl, methodically dismantle her life, piece by piece. "All right, folks, let's move on to the big ticket item." Earl's voice, amplified by a crackling speaker, boomed across the assembled crowd of farmers. They stood in clusters, their faces grim, some with pity, others with a vulture's patience. "What we have here is a real beauty. A 1971 John Deere 4220, barely 500 hours on the tach. Frank, God rest his soul, bought her brand new this spring. Power steering, sound guard body, the whole 9 yards. A farmer's dream, right here." Martha flinched. Frank's dream. It was a beautiful machine, a gleaming green and yellow monster that dwarfed everything else in the yard. He'd been so proud of it, polishing the chrome exhaust stack until it shone like a mirror. He'd talked for weeks about how it would change everything, how they'd be able to work twice the land in half the time. He'd signed the papers with a flourish, his eyes alight with a fever she hadn't understood. The bank man, Mr. Caldwell, had been there that day, smiling his oily smile, clapping Frank on the back. Caldwell was here today too. He stood near the front, wearing a pressed suit and city shoes that looked ridiculous in the muddy farmyard. He wasn't bidding. He didn't have to. The bank already owned it all. He was just here to watch, to make sure the bank got its pound of flesh. His eyes met Martha's for a fleeting second, and a flicker of something, not pity, but a cold, professional satisfaction, passed over his face. "All right, who'll start the bidding for me on this fine piece of John Deere engineering?" Earl chirped. "Do I hear 20,000? 20,000 for a machine that's practically new." Silence. The farmers shuffled their feet. $20,000 was a king's ransom. Frank had paid more, financed over 10 years. The payments were a staggering sum, a number that had made Martha's stomach clench even when he was alive and strong. Now, with him gone just 3 months, a heart attack in the South 40, his hand still on the wheel of that very tractor, the number was an anchor dragging her down into a sea of red ink. The bidding started low, haltingly. A man from the next county over finally opened at 12,000. It crawled upwards in painful $500 increments. Martha felt each bid like a physical blow. That tractor was supposed to be their future. Now it was just an asset to be liquidated. She turned her gaze away from the green giant and looked toward the back of the machine shed, where a rusty splash of red sat half hidden in the shadows. It was Frank's father's tractor, an old Farmall M from 1949. It was the first machine Frank had ever driven. He'd taught her to drive on it, her hands small on the big steel steering wheel, his rough hands guiding hers. It was ugly, stained with the grease of 30 years, its paint faded and chipped. The narrow front end looked primitive next to the 4320's wide stance. But it was theirs, paid for in full decades ago by Frank's father, with cash earned from sweat and good harvests. Caldwell had wanted it in the auction. "Every little bit helps, Mrs. Miller," he'd said, his voice dripping with false sympathy. "It's an antique, might fetch a few $100s from a collector." "No," Martha had said, her voice quiet but firm. It was the only time she'd stood up to him. "That one stays." He had shrugged, a dismissive gesture that said it didn't matter. The Farmall was a pittance. The real money was in the new Deere, the 6-bottom plough, the new disc harrow, the grain drill. All of it bought on credit, all of it bearing the bank's lien. The final bid for the 4320 came in at $18,500, a sickeningly low price, but more than anyone expected. Earl slammed his gavel down. "Sold!" Martha watched them haul it away, the big diesel engine rumbling to life, leaving a black puff of smoke hanging in the air like a funeral shroud. One by one, the other pieces of equipment went. The plough, the planter, the baler. Each sale was a fresh wound. By the end of the day, the farmyard was nearly empty. The crowd dispersed, their hushed conversations fading as their pickups rattled down the long gravel drive. Only Mr. Caldwell remained. He walked over to her, his polished shoes crunching on the gravel. He held a clipboard. "Well, Mrs. Miller," he began, not even trying to sound compassionate anymore. "The auction brought in a total of $32,650. A respectable sum, all things considered." Martha said nothing. She just stared at the empty space where the 4320 had been. "After the auctioneer's commission and fees," he continued, tapping his pen on the clipboard, "we can apply roughly $30,000 to the outstanding principal. Frank's total equipment loan balance was $80,000. He paused for effect. "That leaves you with a remaining debt of $50,000 to the bank." $50,000. The words echoed in the sudden emptiness of the farmyard. It was an impossible number. More money than she had ever seen. More than the farm itself was worth in those lean years. "I don't know how I can—" she started, her voice barely a whisper. "The bank is prepared to be reasonable," Caldwell cut in smoothly. "We will, of course, foreclose on the land to cover the remaining debt. It's the simplest way. You'll be free and clear. You're a young woman. You can move to town, get a job at the diner, start over." Start over? This farm had been in the Miller family for 3 generations. Frank's grandfather had broken the sod here. Frank was buried on the little hill overlooking the creek. Leaving was not an option. It was a betrayal. "No," she said again, her voice finding a sliver of steel. Caldwell sighed, an exaggerated theatrical sound of a patient man dealing with a fool. "Mrs. Miller, be realistic. You have no equipment. You have a mountain of debt. What are you going to do? Farm this land with that relic?" He gestured dismissively toward the old Farmall M. A spark ignited in Martha's chest. It was a tiny thing, but it was warm. It was anger. "Yes," she said, looking him straight in the eye. "That's exactly what I'm going to do." He actually chuckled. A short, sharp, disbelieving laugh. "With that? It's a glorified garden tractor by today's standards. You'll kill yourself trying." He shook his head. "The bank's offer stands for 30 days. After that, we begin foreclosure proceedings. Think it over." He turned and walked back to his shiny sedan, leaving Martha alone in the echoing silence, with the setting sun casting a long shadow from the little red tractor that was all she had left. Now, before we get into the nuts and bolts of how a grieving widow with $50,000 of debt planned to tackle this mountain with a 30-year-old tractor, I have to ask you folks listening, have you ever had to stand your ground when the whole world, the bankers, the neighbors, everyone was telling you to give up and walk away? Let me know your story down in the comments, because Martha's fight is a testament to that very kind of grit. And believe me, her fight was just getting started. The first winter was the hardest. The cold seemed to seep right through the farmhouse walls, a constant, biting reminder of her isolation. The $50,000 debt felt like a physical presence, a ghost sitting at the dinner table with her every night. The bank sent letters, formal and menacing, counting down the days until the foreclosure would begin. Martha used them to start the fire in the wood stove. She spent her days in the machine shed with the Farmall. It hadn't been run in over a year, and it looked even worse up close. Rust blotched its red paint like a skin disease. The tires were cracked and flat. A bird had built a nest in the engine compartment. To most people it was a piece of junk, a forgotten relic. To Martha it was the only tool she had. She found Frank's old manuals, their pages soft and stained with grease. She read them by the light of a single bare bulb hanging from a cord, her breath fogging in the cold air. She learned the tractor's anatomy, the 4-cylinder gasoline engine, the 5-speed transmission, the PTO shaft, the hydraulic lift-all system. The words were foreign at first, a language of gaskets and carburetors and magnetos, but she was a quick study, driven by a desperation that sharpened her mind. Her first task was the tires. The rear ones were massive, taller than she was. She couldn't afford new ones, so she had to patch the old ones. She wrestled the first one off the rim with a set of tire irons, her muscles screaming in protest. It took her 2 days of sweat and curses, her knuckles raw and bleeding, but she finally got the tube out, found the leaks in a tub of water, and painstakingly applied the rough, sticky patches. Getting the tire back on the rim was even harder. She used a sledgehammer and sheer will, the sound of her grunts and the clang of steel on steel echoing in the silent shed. Next was the engine. She drained the old, sludgy oil, which came out thick as molasses. She cleaned the sediment bowl under the gas tank, a disgusting mess of rust and ancient, varnished fuel. She pulled the spark plugs, cleaned the electrodes with a wire brush, and set the gap with a feeler gauge, just like the manual said. She discovered the distributor cap was cracked. A trip to town and $5 precious got her a new one. The man at the Napa store, old Mr. Henderson, looked at her with pity. "You sure you know what you're doing, Martha? That's a lot of tractor for a little gal." "I'm learning," she said, her chin held high. The biggest challenge was the carburetor. The tractor would crank but wouldn't start. It wasn't getting fuel. Following the manual's diagrams, she carefully disassembled the complex little mechanism on her workbench, laying each tiny screw and jet on a clean rag in the order she removed them. She soaked the parts in kerosene, scrubbing away decades of grime with an old toothbrush until the brass shone. When she put it all back together, her hands were trembling, terrified she had forgotten a piece. The day she tried to start it for the first time was cold and grey. She filled the radiator with fresh antifreeze and the tank with a few gallons of gasoline, the cost of which made her wince. She checked the oil one last time. Climbing into the hard steel seat, she pulled the choke, turned the key, and pressed the starter button. The engine turned over with a slow, grinding groan. "Roar!" Nothing. She tried again. "Roar!" Silence. Panic began to creep in. What if she couldn't do it? What if Caldwell and everyone else was right? She closed her eyes, took a deep breath, and pictured Frank's face, his easy smile. "You gotta feather the throttle, Marty," she could almost hear him say. She tried a third time, this time gently pressing the foot throttle as she hit the starter. The engine groaned, coughed once, then twice. A puff of black smoke shot out of the exhaust pipe. And then, with a deafening roar, the old Farmall M shuddered to life. The whole shed vibrated with the deep, rhythmic pop, pop, pop of the 4-cylinder engine. It wasn't a smooth sound, like the new deer's purr. It was a raw, mechanical heartbeat, a loud and proud declaration that it was still alive. Martha burst into tears, a strange mix of joy, relief, and exhaustion. She sat there for a long time, just listening to the engine run, the smell of gasoline and exhaust fumes filling the air. It was the sweetest smell in the world. It was the smell of hope. That spring, while her neighbors were out in their fields with their big new tractors, pulling 8-bottom plows and 20-foot discs, Martha was out in hers with the old Farmall. She had a rusty 2-bottom plow she'd found at the back of the shed. It was slow, painstaking work. The tractor had no cab, and the wind whipped at her face, chapping her skin. The steel seat was unforgiving on her bones. Steering was a physical battle. Without power steering, every turn of the wheel was an act of brute force. She could only plow a few acres a day. From the road, she must have looked like a picture from a history book, a tiny figure on a tiny tractor, crawling across a vast field. Some of the neighbors would slow their trucks as they drove by, shaking their heads. She knew what they were thinking. Poor Frank Miller's widow. She's lost her mind. Caldwell came by one afternoon in April. He parked his sedan at the end of the field and walked out to meet her, his city shoes sinking into the soft, ploughed earth. She saw him coming and shut down the tractor, the sudden silence ringing in her ears. "Working hard, I see," he said, a smug little smile on his face. He looked at the small patch of ploughed ground, and then at the vast expanse of unploughed field beyond it. "At this rate, you might get your corn planted by July." "I'll get it done," Martha said, wiping grease from her hands with a rag. "Look, Mrs. Miller," he said, his tone shifting to one of feigned concern, "I admire your tenacity. I really do. But this is unsustainable. The first payment on the restructured loan is due in 2 months. $1,000. How do you plan to make that payment, let alone the ones after it?" Martha's heart sank. $1,000. She had barely 100 to her name. "The bank has a new offer," he went on. "A local developer is interested in the parcel by the highway. He'll pay a good price. Enough to clear your debt entirely. You could walk away with a small nest egg. A fresh start." She looked past him, at the farmhouse her husband's grandfather had built, at the old oak tree they'd had their wedding picture taken under. "This is my start," she said. "This is my home. I'm not selling." Caldwell's patience finally snapped. The mask of civility fell away. "You are a fool, woman," he hissed. "You're living in the past. This isn't 1950. You can't run a modern farm with a museum piece. You're going to fail. And when you do, the bank will take everything. Don't come crying to me then." He turned on his heel and stalked back to his car, leaving muddy footprints in her freshly ploughed field. Martha watched him go, his words ringing in her ears. She was tired, she was sore, and she was scared. But as she climbed back onto the hard steel seat of the Farmall and fired the engine back to life, the anger returned, burning away the fear. She put the tractor in gear and lowered the plough. She would show him. She would show them all. The early 1970s arrived like a fever dream for American agriculture. Suddenly, the world was hungry, and the American farmer was tasked with feeding it. Grain prices, which had been stagnant for years, shot through the roof. Russia, facing a disastrous harvest, started buying American wheat in massive quantities in what became known as the Great Grain Robbery. The government, led by Secretary of Agriculture Earl Butz, told farmers to plant fence row to fence row. Land values skyrocketed. The good times were here, and it seemed like they would last forever. For farmers who had gambled on debt, it was a golden age. Men who had borrowed heavily to buy new equipment like Frank's 4320 were now reaping enormous profits. They bought more land at inflated prices, leveraging it to buy even bigger and more powerful machines. The International Harvester, 1066s, and John Deere 4430s, became the new kings of the field. Martha's neighbor to the north, a man named Tom Haskins, bought a brand new Steiger, a massive 4-wheel drive articulated tractor that could pull a 30-foot cultivator. He'd drive past Martha's fields, sitting high in his air-conditioned cab, listening to the radio, while she was out on the open seat of the Farmall, eating dust. Haskins and others like him saw Martha as a cautionary tale, a relic of a bygone era. They would see her at the co-op, her hands permanently stained with grease, buying a 5-gallon can of gasoline while they were filling up 100-gallon diesel tanks. They'd talk about her in hushed, pitying tones at the diner. "Poor thing," they'd say, "too stubborn for her own good. If she'd just sold out back then, she'd be set. Instead, she's breaking her back for pennies." But they didn't see the whole picture. They didn't see her ledger book spread out on the kitchen table late at night. Every bushel of corn, every bale of hay, every dollar spent was meticulously recorded in her neat, careful script. While they were taking on more debt to finance their expanding empires, Martha was living on almost nothing. She patched her clothes, canned vegetables from her garden, and heated the house with wood she cut herself from the back woodlot. Every single cent of profit went to one place: the bank. Her payments were always on time, sometimes even a few days early. She'd drive into town in her old Ford pickup and walk into the bank, right past the loan officers' desks, and hand her payment directly to the teller. Mr. Caldwell would sometimes see her. He stopped making offers. Now he just gave her a look of mild amusement, as if she were a curious pet project. He couldn't understand her. With corn at $4 a bushel, she could have easily qualified for a loan for a newer tractor, for a small combine. She could have made her life easier. But Martha had learned Frank's lesson the hard way. Debt was a poison. It promised freedom, but delivered only slavery. The Farmall M might be slow and uncomfortable, but it was hers. It asked for nothing but gasoline, oil, and her own sweat. There were no payments, no interest, no lien holder waiting to snatch it away. She made progress, slow and steady as the turning of the seasons. The first year, she cleared $5,000 of the principal. The next, with better weather and higher prices, she paid off $8,000. The year after that, another 10. The neighbors didn't see it. They only saw the old tractor, the small acreage, the woman working from sunup to sundown. They saw poverty. They didn't see the freedom she was painstakingly buying back, one payment at a time. By the fall of 1975, 5 years after the auction, she had whittled the debt down to just under $10,000. It was an astonishing achievement, a testament to a level of discipline her high-flying neighbors couldn't comprehend. She felt a flicker of pride, a sense that the end was finally in sight. She was going to make it. She was going to keep the farm. But the world was changing. On the nightly news, Walter Cronkite spoke of an oil embargo by a group of countries she'd never heard of. The price of gasoline at the co-op pump began to creep up, then leap. The news was filled with talk of inflation, a word that sounded ominous and threatening. The Federal Reserve, in an effort to combat it, began raising interest rates, first by 1/4 of a point, then 1/2. The numbers were small, abstract. They didn't seem to have anything to do with her world of soil and seasons. One crisp afternoon in November, she was in the machine shed, getting the Farmall ready for winter. She was draining the oil when Tom Haskins pulled into the yard in his shiny new pickup. He sauntered into the shed, a worried look on his face that he tried to hide with a swagger. "Martha," he said, kicking at a loose piece of gravel. "Heard anything about what the bank's doing?" "I don't pay much attention to bank gossip, Tom," she said, not looking up from her work. "It ain't gossip," he said, his voice tight. "My operating loan. The interest rate is variable. It just jumped 2 full points." 2. on the money I borrowed for seed and fertilizer this spring. And Caldwell says it's going to go higher. A lot higher. He shook his head, looking around the modest shed. I don't know how I'm going to cash flow this. The payments on the new combine alone are, well, they're staggering. Martha slowly straightened up, wiping her hands on her rag. She looked at Haskins, a man who had pitied her for 5 years, and for the first time, she saw fear in his eyes. The easy confidence was gone, replaced by the panicked look of a man who suddenly realizes the ground beneath his feet isn't solid at all. It was just a thin crust over a sea of debt, and that crust was beginning to crack. A cold knot formed in her stomach. The storm was coming, and she knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that for men like Tom Haskins, there would be no shelter. The dry summer of 1979 bled into a drier fall. The sky over the heartland turned a hazy, brassy color, and the corn in the fields, which should have been tall and green, was stunted and yellowed, the leaves curling in on themselves as if in prayer for a rain that never came. Dust, fine as powdered sugar, coated everything. It settled on the window sills of Martha's farmhouse. It worked its way into the creases of her skin, and it rose in great choking clouds behind the tires of the Farmall M as she worked her meager fields. For men like Tom Haskins, the drought was a catastrophe. They had borrowed against the promise of $5 corn and 200 bushel an acre yields. Now, with the harvest barely reaching half that, and prices beginning to soften, the math was turning ugly. The massive, complex machines they had bought to work their sprawling acreages were now a liability. One sweltering afternoon in August, Martha was replacing a leaky gasket on the Farmall's water pump. A $2 part, and an hour of her time, when she saw the John Deere service truck rumble down the road and turn into Haskins Lane. It stayed there for 2 days. The talk at the co-op was that the transmission on his 4-wheel drive Steiger had gone out. A $10,000 repair, they whispered. $10,000 to fix a machine he was already paying for, a machine that was now sitting idle while his crops withered in the field. Martha, by contrast, felt the drought as a hardship, not a death sentence. Her costs were minimal. Her fuel bill for the gasoline-powered Farmall was a fraction of what her neighbors paid for diesel. When a bearing went out on her old 2-row corn picker, she found the part number in the manual, ordered it from a specialty supplier for $30, and installed it herself using a hammer and a block of wood. Her world was one of simple, understandable mechanics. Theirs was becoming one of sealed hydraulic systems, complex electronics, and dealer-only repairs that cost more than her entire tractor was worth. The pressure from the bank intensified. Mr. Caldwell was gone, replaced by a younger man with an even colder smile named Peterson. He didn't bother with false sympathy. His letters were blunt, his phone calls demanding. The prime interest rate, the number that governed everything, was climbing relentlessly. 10%, 12, 15. For farmers with variable rate operating loans, each tick upwards was another turn of the screw. Peterson was aggressively pushing them to refinance their land at the new, inflated values to consolidate their debt. It was a trap dressed up as a lifeline, locking them into higher payments for decades to come. He called Martha one evening. "Mrs. Miller," he said, his voice slick and impatient, "we see you've paid your loan down to under $2,000. Congratulations. Now is the perfect time to leverage your equity. Land values in your area are at an all-time high. You could borrow enough to buy a modern tractor, a new planter. Increase your efficiency. You're leaving money on the table." Martha stood in her quiet kitchen, looking out the window at the little red tractor parked by the shed. "Mr. Peterson," she said, her voice calm and steady. "I'm not interested in leaving money on the table. I'm interested in keeping a roof over my head. I'll be in next month with the final payment." There was a stunned silence on the other end of the line. He couldn't comprehend it. In his world of leverage and credit, paying something off was an absurdity. It was a failure to maximize assets. "That's unconventional," he finally managed to say. "It works for me," Martha replied, and gently hung up the phone. A month later, she walked into the bank. It was the first week of December, 1980. She was wearing her good coat. She bypassed the teller line and walked directly to Peterson's desk. She placed an envelope in front of him. Inside was a cashier's check for $1,842.16, the final payment. He looked at the check, then at her. The condescending smile was gone. In its place was a look of grudging, baffled respect. "Well, I'll be," he muttered, stamping the loan documents with a heavy, final-sounding thud. "Paid in full." Martha didn't smile. She simply nodded, took a copy of the stamped papers, and walked out of the bank into the cold winter air. 10 years. 10 years of back-breaking work, of scrimping and saving, of being laughed at and pitied. She was 42 years old. Her body ached in places she didn't know could ache, and her hands were calloused and rough as sandpaper. But for the first time since Frank's death, she was free. The farm was hers. All of it. The land, the house, the barn, and the little red tractor that had saved her. She didn't know it yet, but her timing couldn't have been more perfect. The good times were over. The decade of debt was about to be paid for, and the bill was coming due for everyone else. The storm broke in 1981. It wasn't a storm of wind and rain, but of crushing economic forces that swept across the Midwest like a prairie fire. The Federal Reserve, in a desperate war against inflation, pushed the prime interest rate to an unimaginable 21%. Simultaneously, President Carter announced a grain embargo against the Soviet Union in response to their invasion of Afghanistan. The bottom fell out of the commodities market. Corn that had been $4 a bushel was suddenly worth less than $2. For the farmers who had bet the farm on ever-rising prices and ever-increasing debt, it was a wipeout. The math that had been so seductive just a few years before was now a death sentence. They owed money on land, valued at $3,000 an acre, but that land was now worth less than $1,000. They had payments on $100,000 combines to harvest a crop that wouldn't even cover the cost of their fuel. The very foundation of their world, the idea that land was always a safe investment, had crumbled to dust. The auction notices started appearing in the local paper. At first it was just one or two, whispered about at the diner. Then it became a flood. Every week, another family farm went under the hammer. The headlines were filled with stories of desperation, of farmers chaining their gates shut to keep the sheriff out, of protests and heartbreak. It was a slow, grinding depression that hollowed out the small towns and broke the spirit of a generation. Martha watched it all from the quiet sanctuary of her debt-free farm. Her life didn't change. She still rose before the sun, still drove the old Farmall, still lived frugally. But now, her simple, careful way of life was no longer a sign of poverty. It was a fortress. While her neighbors were forced to sell their grain the moment it came out of the field, for whatever pitiful price the elevator offered, Martha could afford to wait. She had enough in savings to pay her property taxes and buy seed for the next year. She stored her corn in her own small bin, a luxury few could now afford. She wasn't getting rich, but she was surviving. And in the farm crisis of the 1980s, survival was the only victory that mattered. One Saturday in the spring of 1983, she saw the familiar brightly colored auction flyers posted at the post office. This one, however, made her stomach clench. The name on the top was Tom Haskins. The list of equipment was a litany of modern farming might: a Steiger Panther 4-wheel drive tractor, an International Harvester 1460 axial flow combine, a Kinzer planter, a fleet of wagons and plows. It was the dream inventory of the 1970s, now being sold off in a nightmare. When the day of the auction came, Martha drove her old pickup to the Haskins farm. The scene was grimly familiar. It was the same crowd of grim-faced farmers, the same fast-talking auctioneer, the same smell of defeat hanging in the air. But this time, she wasn't the one being pitied. She stood at the back of the crowd and watched as Tom's life was dismantled, piece by piece. The big Steiger, the one that had cost him over $100,000, sold for 20 cents on the dollar to a corporate farm from out of state. The combine went for even less. She saw Tom standing by his machine shed, his shoulders slumped, his face ashen. His wife stood beside him, her arms wrapped around herself, as if to keep from flying apart. Martha remembered that feeling all too well. The numbness, the public humiliation, the sense of being utterly hollowed out. She saw Peterson from the bank nearby, his face impassive, clipboard in hand, just as Caldwell had been at her own auction. The faces changed, but the roles remained the same. The auctioneer moved on to the smaller items. "All right, folks, what am I bid for this fine John Deere 2510 gas tractor? A good little utility tractor, runs great. Who'll start it at $5,000? Silence. The 2510 was from the mid-60s. It was too small for the big operators, and nobody else had any money. It was a good tractor, but it was an orphan of a bygone era. $4,000, the auctioneer pleaded. $3,000? Martha watched as Tom Haskins flinched. She knew that tractor. It had been his father's. It was the first tractor Tom had ever driven, the one he'd used when he was just starting out, before the boom times and the easy credit had lured him into the big leagues. It was his equivalent of her Farmall M. $1,000, Martha said, her voice clear and steady. A ripple went through the crowd. Heads turned. A few people murmured. Martha Miller. Bidding? The auctioneer seized on it. "I've got 1,000. Do I hear 1,500? Silence. "Sold!" the auctioneer cried, slamming his hand down. "For $1,000 to Martha Miller." After the auction was over and the crowds had drifted away, leaving the Haskins farmyard eerily empty, Martha found Tom. He was leaning against the now empty machine shed, staring at nothing. "Tom," she said softly. He looked up, his eyes vacant. "Come to gloat, Martha. Come to see the big shot get his comeuppance?" "No," she said. "I came to give you this." She held out the bill of sale for the John Deere 2510. "The title is in your name. It's paid for. It's yours." He stared at the paper, then at her, his face a mask of confusion. "Why?" he whispered. "After all the times all the things we said." "Because nobody should have to lose their father's tractor," Martha said. "And because you're going to need something to make a living with." She reached into her pocket and pulled out a key. "I'm keeping the north 80 acres I bought last year in hay. I could use some help cutting and baling this summer. I pay a fair wage." Tom Haskins, a man who had once owned 1,000 acres and a fleet of giant machines, looked down at the key in his hand, and for the first time that day, his shoulders began to shake. He wasn't crying from shame or loss, but from the crushing weight of an unexpected kindness. The years that followed were quiet ones for Martha. The farm crisis slowly receded, leaving a scarred but wiser landscape in its wake. The community had changed. The go-go mentality of the 70s was gone, replaced by a hard-won caution. Size was no longer the sole measure of a farmer's success. Now they talked about debt-to-asset ratios and input costs. The farmers who had survived were the ones who, like Martha, had learned to be resilient, to make do, to fix what was broken, and to respect the unforgiving logic of a ledger book. Martha's farm never got much bigger. She bought the 40-acre parcel of woods and pasture that bordered her property to the east, the very piece Caldwell had once tried to get her to sell to a developer. She didn't plow it. She fixed the fences, cleared the brush, and ran a small herd of beef cattle, creating a diverse and stable operation that could withstand the shocks of the market. She became an unlikely pillar of the community. Young farmers, wary of the banks and the big equipment dealers, would stop by her place. They'd find her in the machine shed, her hands greasy, a wrench in her hand. They didn't come for loans, they came for advice. "My baler's skipping knots," a young man might say. And Martha, instead of telling him to call a mechanic, would wipe her hands on a rag and say, "Well, let's take a look. Probably just the billhook tension. Hand me that 3/4-inch wrench." She taught them how to read a parts manual, how to weld a broken hitch, how to time an engine. She wasn't just teaching them mechanics. She was teaching them independence. Tom Haskins never got back the land he lost, but he found a different kind of life. He worked for Martha for a few years, his quiet competence a good match for her steady hand. Eventually, he saved enough to start a small custom farming business with the old John Deere 2510 she had bought for him. He worked for the smaller farmers, the ones the big operators couldn't be bothered with. He and Martha remained friends, a bond forged not in prosperity, but in the shared understanding of loss and survival. One warm evening, in the late summer of her 65th year, Martha sat on her porch swing, watching the sun dip below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. The air was cool, carrying the scent of freshly cut hay and damp earth. From the machine shed, she could hear a faint ticking sound as the engine of the Farmall M cooled after a day's work. It had been with her for nearly 30 years now. The red paint was almost entirely faded to a soft, rusty pink. The seat was patched with duct tape, and the steering wheel was worn smooth from the grip of her hands. It had demanded everything from her, her sweat, her tears, her strength, and in return, it had given her everything, her home, her freedom, her life. A pickup truck rattled down her long gravel driveway. It was Tom Haskins's son, a young man of 20 with his father's eyes and a farmer's ambition. He had a cracked distributor cap in his hand. "Evening, Martha," he called out, walking up to the porch. "The old M you sold me won't start. Figured it was this." Martha smiled. She had sold him an old Farmall she'd bought for parts years ago, a twin to her own, for $100. "That'll do it," she said, nodding at the broken part. "There's a spare one in the coffee can on the workbench. You know where to find the tools." "Yes, Ma'am," he said. He paused for a moment. "Thanks, Martha. For everything." "Just pass it on, son," she said softly. "Just pass it on." He disappeared into the dusky light of the machine shed, and soon she heard the metallic clink of wrenches. Martha leaned her head back against the porch swing's chain, the gentle creak a familiar rhythm. She looked out over her fields, dark and quiet under the rising moon. The land was paid for. The farm was safe. Frank could rest easy on the hill overlooking the creek. She had kept her promise. She had held on. And in the deep, quiet peace of the heartland, she knew she had built a legacy not of acres or wealth, but of something far more durable. A life carved from grit and grace, earned one hard day at a time behind the wheel of a simple red tractor.